Hello, and welcome to One-on-One with Robert Doar. I'm your host, Robert Doar, and thanks for tuning in today. As president of the American Enterprise Institute, I have the unique privilege of working with America's greatest policy experts. These scholars focus on policy issues in the fields of education, economics, energy, foreign and defense, and so much more. Subscribe to this podcast for exclusive access to in-depth discussions on the most pressing policy issues. Together, with my guests, we'll challenge political preconceptions, explore innovative ideas, and create, I hope, a freer and safer world. This week, we have the great pleasure and real treat to have make a big exception also, in that this is not an AEI scholar. This is a friend and partner, Kim Kagan, the president and founder of the Institute for the Study of War, which is a really tight research partner with our Critical Threats Project, also which is at AEI. And we do a lot of work together with them. In fact, we're often published, in which both of us are credited for our work on mapping conflicts around the world. And we love having Kim with us, and it's a real honor to have her, but this is an exception. We don't often have non-AEI scholars on, but in this case, I think it's justified given what's going on. Kim is probably the foremost expert on the war in Ukraine, the actual what's happening in the war in Ukraine, at least the foremost American expert. And she's a former history professor at West Point and has served in both Iraq and Afghanistan in various capacities. And Kim, it's an honor to have you on our show.
Thank you so much for having me, Robert.
So let's get right to it. We are coming to you on Monday morning, March 10th, and every day seems like major developments are happening concerning the war in Ukraine. What is the status of the battlefield right now? How long is the line, and how stable is the line that cuts across eastern Ukraine?
Thank you, Robert. So we are observing daily changes in the war in Ukraine. Right now, the front line in Ukraine is about 2,100 kilometers long. And that really is through occupied Ukraine and Ukraine's international border with Russia, up to the border with Belarus.
If I were to land anywhere on that line, that's very clear in your maps, with the red on one side and the blue on the other, would there be trenches no matter where I land? Is it entirely trenched?
So there are different sections of this front line. There are many, 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 many trenches. But I think what's important to understand about this front line is that there are different battles going on in different sectors of the front line. And the battlefields are essentially fortified differently, sector by sector. So if we look at one of the most contested sectors, which is in the area near Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar in the Donetsk region, what we actually see is a fortification belt of Ukrainian fortified cities that pre-existed before the war, and that the Ukrainians are ferociously defending against Russia's advance. And Pokrovsk has been the main effort of Russian forces for almost a year.
And so sticking with this sort of image of the battlefield, and let's say in that particular area, when you say they're ferociously fighting, like what is happening? What weapons are being shot at who and across what lines? How is it being engaged?
So one of the things that we see is that the Russians have attempted a number of armored attacks against Ukrainian positions, including an armored attack over this past weekend in order to try to dislodge the Ukrainian forces from the entrenched and fortified positions that they hold.
So in my limited reading of military history, an armored attack, in my mind, envisions, you soften them up with artillery, and then you put tanks and men on the march going toward a line to try to take it. Is that what you're describing?
That is what I am describing. And the Russians sent an armored column with approximately 25 tanks over the weekend, and the Ukrainians destroyed 16 of them. So you might want to know how that happens.
Yes, how did that happen?
And so one of the things that we have seen on the battlefield in Ukraine is that it's highly lethal. And we talk a lot about a transparent battlefield. That doesn't mean that the battlefield is invisible. It means that because of the amount of data and visibility that both the Russian and the Ukrainian forces have, if you can see it, you can shoot it. And if you can shoot it, you can kill it. And so armor and armored columns have not really been successful because they are large, they are moving,
and
they're visible.
Yeah.
And so the Ukrainians are stopping these armored columns in a number of ways. Of course, they have their own artillery, but they also have unmanned systems, drones, that are extremely precise and effective. And they have innovated their drone program in a number of ways. To tell you the truth, Robert, I did not think that an unmanned aerial vehicle of the small size that is common in Ukraine could take out a tank. But because a tank is so heavily armored, and these drones have relatively lighter payloads. But what we have seen is that the Ukrainians have actually developed a capability where they precisely place a very lethal, explosively formed penetrator right at the turret of a Russian armored vehicle. That's a design flaw in the Russian tank, and it creates a mobility kill.
So this weekend activity, and we could do the whole line, but let's stick here, which you described. I think 28 tanks, 16 were taken out by the Ukrainian drones and other efforts. What was the casualty count?
That I don't know. So great question. And honestly, I'd have to look that up.
Okay, that's fine. But let's talk about the weekly casualty count in the last 3 months for both sides. Can when you're a lot younger than I am, Kim, but when I was a young kid, they used to talk about the casualty count from Vietnam, and it became a real burden on President Johnson. But I don't see that as much here. Now, obviously, American soldiers are not involved. But what is the casualty count on a weekly basis right now?
So the Russians are taking extraordinary casualties in Ukraine. And I think I'm really glad that you asked this question because the Russians are presenting this war as something that they can win and that they are winning. And that is not the case. The Russians are making very slow, very grinding gains and taking extremely high rates of casualties. And so let me actually talk about this section of the line. In October of 2024, so a few months ago, the U.S. Department of Defense assessed that Russian forces were suffering 1,200 casualties per day across all the lines. That is to say, 6,000 casualties per month.
And a casualty is both killed and injured.
Correct. So
and taken out of the line.
They're taken out of the line. And that is an extraordinary number. It's an extraordinary number. And I want to put it in perspective in a couple of different ways. First, let's actually talk about the Russians' total casualties in this war. The Russian forces suffered about 434,000 casualties in 2024. 150,000 Russians were killed in action in 2024. And since February 22, when the Russians launched their illegal invasion, there have been about 300 or 350,000 Russians killed and 600,000 or 700,000 Russians wounded. So that gives you a sense of the scale of this war and the devastation that it is imposing on the Russian military and the Russian population.
And what about on the Ukraine side?
So we do not actually keep casualty figures and casualty statistics ourselves at ISW on the Ukrainian side. What we know is that President Zelensky himself stated that Russia has killed 46,000 Ukrainian soldiers since the start of the full-scale invasion, and that Ukraine has suffered approximately 390,000 soldiers wounded in action. So that is a high number, but it is nothing.
So
like
their casualties
the
are less than a half of what the Russians are suffering in both killed and injured.
Correct.
Similar, but a lot for a country like the size of Ukraine. It's a devastating war on both sides.
Certainly.
And just on the Russian side, so you've told us about the use of the drones to attack the attacking armor, and you've specifically mentioned, what is the way in which Russians are killing Ukrainians?
So there are some similar features. The Russians obviously themselves have a lot of artillery, and that's a characteristic of Soviet armies that the Russian armed forces have carried forward. And so artillery barrages are extremely important on this battlefield, and they remain important even as the Russians also have their own drones, their own unmanned systems that inflict damage on the Ukrainian forces. And I want to talk a little bit about this because I think you'll find it really interesting. It's very important that on this very modern battlefield, the battlefield is very modern, right? We think about trenches and we think about the First World War, and that gives us a slightly wrong impression of the kinds of fighting that we see. Because what we are observing is that in order to create maneuver on this battlefield, or in order to try to restore maneuver on this battlefield, the Ukrainians and the Russians are innovating and innovating at differential rates. The Ukrainians are the better innovators, and we can talk about why. But they're bringing a suite of technologies to bear in order to make their unmanned systems extremely lethal. The Russians have unmanned systems, and they're doing very interesting things with them. But they're also using something that has been very important this past year called a glide bomb. And those glide bombs are essentially their air power answer right now. And to be honest with you, Robert, I'm not the right expert to explain exactly how how these glide bombs work, but essentially they are being launched they're being launched from areas near to the battlefields, and they're able to essentially be slightly steered and controlled into Ukrainian positions, and they are causing a lot of casualties.
One of the things we read about in the newspapers is the Russian tendency to try to terrorize the civilian population of Ukraine with missile barrages. Am I right about that?
Absolutely. I'd like to talk very much about the Russian targeting of civilian targets and the Russian missile barrages, because I think they're extremely important. First and foremost, the Russians have actually increased the number and lethality of their missile barrages since January of this year. And I think that's very important to understand because it means that these strikes are more frequent and more powerful and more effective than they had been before. You'll ask why. I don't know why they're more frequent, but I can tell you why they're more powerful. They're more powerful because the Russians are integrating more and more Iranian-type Shahed drones into their missile strikes, and they are adding more decoys into their missile strikes. And the reason why this is important is that it creates a greater problem of interception of these incoming missiles. So it makes it very hard to protect the energy infrastructure or the frankly, or the civilian targets that the Russians are hitting.
Is there a casualty count on civilians that we can talk about between the two countries? In other words, it sounds to me like Ukraine is fighting soldiers and Russians are fighting people. Is that right?
Yes.
Soldiers and Russians are fighting soldiers and people.
The Russians are deliberately targeting civilian targets as well as the Ukrainian military forces on the front lines. And by civilian targets, I don't only mean things such as Ukraine's energy grid. The Russians took down a children's hospital inside of Kyiv back in August or September of 2024. And that's just an example of the deliberate targeting of civilians, not just infrastructure, that the Russians have engaged in order to create a campaign of terror against the Ukrainian population.
And again, but is there a civilian casualty count?
There is a civilian casualty count, and Robert, I can't find it.
Okay. Well, but it's.
Let me.
But could one say that the civilian casualty count on Ukraine is larger than it is on Russia?
Vastly. There's vast civilian casualties inside of Ukraine, and I think it's important to recognize that they've come not only through the missile barrages, but also as the Russians have occupied territory in Ukraine. We tend to forget that the Russians actually went through and killed civilians inside of Mariupol, one of the cities that the Russians took in 22, and actually also created in Mariupol essentially filtration camps where they brought the population in, separated families, women, and children, and then ultimately, in addition to killing those whom they assessed had pro-Ukrainian tendencies, they also deported children. And there are now about 1 million Ukrainian children that have been forcibly displaced by Russia from Ukraine into Russia.
1 million?
1 million into Russia, into occupied Ukraine, or into Belarus. This is a project in which Russian state authorities have participated and which they have acknowledged.
So let's talk about the condition and the look and feel of the cities and towns on the eastern side of the line that are occupied by Russia forces, versus on the western side of the line, going all the way to Kiev and the border. The old line from the Greeks or the Romans. They made it a desert and called it peace. Is that the condition of the Ukraine that Russia occupies?
Russia has certainly damaged a considerable amount of the infrastructure and the buildings, et cetera, in the areas that Russia has occupied, and certainly the areas that have been fought over extensively in the entrenched warfare, the artillery barrages, and even in the infantry warfare that we have seen in places like Pokrovsk and in Chasiv Yar in Donetsk. So there are actually, there are places that are behind Russian lines that are destroyed, but the Russians are also somewhat selective, and they are keeping some of the facilities that they think they will need or want to leverage, including, very importantly, the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant.
And on the Ukrainian side, Ukraine's a big country, and then the western side of the border is it's not small. So, and there was in the dialogue between Zelensky and Trump, there was sort of a discussion, and I think President Zelensky was trying to say, well, in many of our cities we have a normal life, or as normal life as it can be when you're a country of war. Is that true? What's that about?
So, as someone who has spent time in Iraq at the height of violence in Baghdad in May 2007, I have to tell you, a place like Kyiv, which is not actually that far west, is a refreshing difference from Baghdad, and I think it's important actually to note this because the Ukrainian government has deliberately protected the ability to govern Ukraine. And so I was surprised my first trip to Kyiv that actually one could walk around the city, and one could walk around and shops were open and things like this. And that although it was slightly militarized, you obviously don't just leave your capital open without some military vehicles, sandbags, and of course the very important interceptors that help keep the missile barrages off it. Government was able to function, and I think that's actually important because it has created some of the resilience that has allowed Ukraine to continue the war.
So that's the esprit de corps, the sense of strength, and they're still in it. Can you assess that? Have you been able to assess the state of the Ukrainian sort of determination?
Well, I'm not sure that one can make an assessment of that because it is a moral factor.
It's hard to measure. And
it is hard to measure. But I think it is certainly important to state that Ukraine is facing an existential threat from Putin. Putin's objectives in Ukraine are wide, they're all-encompassing, and
they're total domination.
And they include total political domination. They include making sure that Ukraine is no longer a sovereign state. Putin also aims to eliminate Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture, and is engaged in many things, both in the occupied areas and, frankly, in his stated negotiating positions as he talks with the world and with President Trump. He's stating things about Ukraine that are actually quite problematic for Ukrainians. So Ukrainians do not imagine that they can survive easily in a Russian-controlled Ukraine. And they have learned from their past experiences with Russia from 2014 onward that the Kremlin uses any attempted ceasefire or any so-called ceasefire as a way of preparing for a next invasion. And so that tends to reinforce the resilience of Ukrainians, even as it makes them extremely eager for peace.
And just one last question on the state of the battlefield. If we were to take all of the Russian and North Korean soldiers in occupied Ukraine and count them up, and then we were to look at all the Ukrainian soldiers on the west side of the line, is there a different? If we were writing the history of it, that the Russian general came to the battle with X number, and the Ukrainian general had another number. Do you have those two numbers?
I don't think I have those two numbers. I do want to talk a little bit about the North Korean forces, if that's
sure.
okay. Look, the way that Russia is able to sustain its war is through partnerships with adversaries of the United States. The Russians actually are extremely vulnerable right now. They have a problem generating manpower. They have an economic problem, and they're short on artillery and other critical ingredients in prosecuting their war. And we at the Institute for the Study of War assessed that the Russians would actually face a crisis because of these shortfalls in about 12 to 18 months. So if we look at the manpower situation that Russia faces, it's pretty grave. Because the Russians have been losing about 36,000 Russian soldiers per month. Well, that's a lot.
That can't go on forever. It can't go on for much longer.
They replace those soldiers, or have been able to replace them, one for one. So the Russians aren't getting more soldiers net. 36,000 out, 36,000 in. When we look at the contribution that North Korea has made, the 10 to 12,000 plus recent reinforcements, those have gone to Kursk, the territory inside of Russia that the Ukrainians took, and that the Russians are now working to get back, and are getting back at a more rapid rate since President Trump ceased sharing U.S. intelligence with Ukrainian forces about a week ago or so. But it shows us this weakness in Russian recruitment, and Putin actually cannot recruit as many as he needs. He is doing voluntary recruitment right now. He's paying for conscripts to join. The amount that he is paying is actually going up. Market forces are at work so that he can't actually get them as cheaply as before. There is a labor shortage in Russia's factories. That means that anybody who goes to the front line isn't filling a necessary manufacturing job and is actually increasing the problems that Russia has manufacturing the goods that it needs to supply its armed forces.
Okay, so do you think that the Ukraine should have, looking back, fought a defensive war and sort of got them to the line and not tried to do the force them out, the offensive back, I think it must be 12 or 15 months ago? And do you think that the effort to go into Russia was that wise or not, looking back?
So that's a wonderful and very interesting question. And we at ISW, some of our analysts have recently made some assessments about the Ukrainian operation into Kursk. And it's too soon to tell. But this is what it does seem to have accomplished. And so let me list that out for you, okay? First of all, the Russian main effort had been to take the city and the fortified area of Pokrovsk in Donetsk Oblast or region. And that was an effort that they had put a lot of forces into. And what we did observe is that as the Ukrainian forces went into Kursk, although the Russians were able to continue their advances toward Pokrovsk, they were not able to take their best units and reinforce their main effort. They had to pull them back and send them to Kursk. So they really delayed the Russian offensive in Pokrovsk, and that petered out. And so given that had been Russia's main effort in 2024, the Ukrainians, with difficulty and with this Kursk operation, were able actually to stop the Russians from achieving their major objective. Now, furthermore, the Russians then had to commit their own forces into Kursk, and they leveraged and widened the war by involving North Korean troops in that fight. And I think it's worth reminding everyone that Russia and North Korea have signed a mutual defense alliance, and so they're buddies now.
Why does Russia get to have foreign troops come into this war and Ukraine can't?
Because and that's a wonderful question, Robert. And I would say that Russia is the aggressor. Russia controls the narrative, and you are quite right to ask why Russia is imposing a double standard. But it is also important to state that the Ukrainian armed forces have done a good job holding their own. I think that the Ukrainian armed forces are really the strongest armed forces in Europe. They are combat experienced. They're technologically sophisticated. They are large and they are savvy. So they are actually contributing tremendously to the defense of Europe against Putin's aggression.
Okay, so last question. For a big portion of the 20th century, Germany was divided between East and West, and no one who looked at that conceded that that's the way it should be forever, or at least they shouldn't have. And it was we'll accept this line for now, but we'll fight again another day. Same with the the Soviet domination of Poland. We had to go along with that in the post-war world. President Roosevelt and Acheson and everyone sort of gave into that, right? It's a way of looking at it. But they didn't say this is how it has to be forever. And, President Reagan said, tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev, and eventually the wall was torn down. So can you envision a post-this war world where a line is drawn, but no one says that's the way it has to always be?
Robert, it's a very good question, and one that I've thought about extensively. I think, like you, I've stood along the Berlin Wall and
shook your fist
and thought very much about history that transpired before and during my lifetime. I would put it this way. First of all, President Zelensky has stated publicly that he may not get all of the territory of Ukraine back. And I think that's an important concession. And I think it's important to recognize that it's one of a number of concessions that President Zelensky has made throughout his discussions with President Trump. He's made some others as well. And so it's a myth right now that President Zelensky is insisting on getting all of the territory of Ukraine back as part of this negotiation. What we see is that he is offering up a number of different accommodations, and that the person who is not making any concessions is Putin. Putin still demands that Ukraine submit its political system to change. Putin has demanded that the negotiations that transpire under a protocol known as the Istanbul Protocols, which demand, among other things, not only the subordination of Ukraine's politics, but the subordination of its military and its reduction to a level that is pre-2014, a disarming of Ukraine in a very Versailles-like way vis-a-vis Germany. So I think it's actually really important.
Now, that's an important point, listeners. The Versailles-like way was the settlement of World War I, which was so humiliating to Germany that it really caused World War II.
Correct.
Is the way of looking at it. And so that's what Putin is demanding. But I got that, and okay. But what I'm just saying is, I think the answer to your question is, the answer to the question I asked, I think, is yes, that could be, so long as the Ukraine west of the line is remained free, independent, and allowed to arm itself.
So I don't think that there will be a return of the Russian-occupied territories through a diplomatic effort post-war, because the Russians don't want to return those territories. And so possibly we can see that in generations, but I think it was unlikely for us to have seen the Cold War end in the way that it did. And it is unlikely that Russia's gains will simply unwind.
It's so funny that not funny, it's tragic, but you you mentioned Cold War, and you said it's unlikely that it ended that way. I remember when I first came to Washington, I was around all the foreign policy people, and I'd ask them questions, and they'd say the best we can hope for is containment. Right. And I'd say, well, what about rollback? What about rollback? They say, no, there's no hope for rollback. And that was before the Berlin Wall came down in Poland and Czechoslovakia, and we had all this growth of freedom and democracy in Eastern Europe. So it may be unlikely, but unlikely things happen.
That is correct, and that is why it is fun to be a student of history and a student of modern contemporary foreign policy. Look, it is imperative that Ukraine actually be able to keep its independence, its sovereignty, its ability to secure and defend itself, to be able to do so through the maintenance and training and development of its armed forces. It is really important that Ukraine have a healthy economy in order to sustain its armed forces as the bulwark that they are to further Russian aggression, because the Russians are aggressors. And the Russian aim is not simply to take Ukraine and to make it subordinate to Russia. The Russians also aim to undermine the U.S. and NATO security treaty that has protected Europe and kept it safe, sound, and hitherto free of major war, allowing our economic prosperity and our freedoms to continue. And so what's at stake in this conflict is not simply the freedom and the sovereignty of Ukraine. It is freedom and sovereignty for European states. It is the prosperity of the United States. This conflict is also about whether other aggressors, autocrats, such as Xi Jinping, can feel themselves to be free to take territory or to remake the world in their image. And so I think the U.S. has a lot at stake here. It's extremely important. And the Ukrainians are actually providing the armed forces that are securing our U.S. interests right now.
Thought that was very good and very eloquent and very true, Kim. I do think that when I think about how the American people react to that, or at least how I react to that, fighting to keep Ukraine free and independent alone should be sufficient for us to justify protecting Ukraine against Russian aggression. And the third point you make, and sending a message to autocrats around the world that this kind of behavior is not acceptable and will be pushed back, is a really important point. The one in between about, the Russian bear coming for the rest of Europe and undermining, European American post-World War II stability, I think that's the one that gets some of our friends in the Trump administration to roll their eyes and look the other way. But the first and third are key. But maybe I'm wrong. But I just think that if I were sitting in the Trump administration and realizing that the rape of Ukraine is going to be on my hands if I let this happen, that should be enough for them to say, I'm not going to let this happen. With that, we'll come back next time. Thank you.